Our next lecture is about arrays. And this will be a really fun lecture because arrays make a lot of the things that we've been done so far a lot more easier. So let's see how. In the previous lectures, we sometimes had different variables for different persons, like the score for Jane, the score for Mark, the score for Mike. And imagine how handy it would be if we could bundle all of these into one single variable. And actually we can, because in JavaScript we have different ways for that actually, and one of them is arrays, which is what we will be talking about in this lecture. So let's write three names right into one variable, and this variable will be an array. Let's call it names, and this is the most common way to write an array, just with the square brackets. So we write John, and then we have a comma for the second element of the array. So now it's Jane, and then the third one is Mark, let's say. That's really easy, right? So before we had to create three different variables for these three people, and now we just have one which acts like a collection of these three. So an array with three strings. And now let's create another array with the years in which these were born. And as I said before, these square brackets are the most common way to create an array. But just for the sake of showing you the other ways, I will do it like this for this array. So we can also write new array, and then in here it's the same. So or three elements, 1990, 1969, and then 9048. So again, we don't need three variables here, but we can do one array which contains all the three birth years. Okay, and now how do we actually access these values out of the array? Let's see what happens if we console log, for example, the names. What happens is that we get an array with John, Jane, and Mark, just as we have in our code. But now suppose that we want to retrieve this value Jane or John. What we will do in this case is to use the square brackets again and then put the order number of the element that we want to retrieve. And in JavaScript, arrays are zero based, which means that the first element has the index number of 0. So in this case John is 0, Jane is 1, and Mark is 2. So if I want John, I have to write 0. Let's see. And here it is, John. So reading a value out of an array is as simple as this. We just write the name of the array, then the square brackets, and then the number of the element that we want. And now if we want Jane, Jane is number 1. And yep, it works the exact same way. And just the last one, number 2, is Mark. And now to change a value in the array or to mutate it, it actually works the exact same way. So if we say names 1, which will be Jane, right? If we say that element 1 of names should be Ben, and then console log the names array, then this should change. And right, it happened. So John, Ben, and Mark, because I mutated the element with the position number 1, which is Jane, or it was Jane, and now it's Ben. So I'm sure you're starting to see how useful this can be. And until now, our arrays were all with the same data type. So we had string, 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 and number, number, number in these three arrays. But we can mix all of these together in one single array, meaning that one array can hold as many different data types as we want. So let's, for example, create an array for John, var John, and again the square brackets, and then we can say John, which is his name, then we can say his last name, Smith, then his year of birth, 1990, his job, which was teacher before, so let's keep it that way. And we can also put his marriage status, so if he's married or not. So a boolean here, which is false. So you see we have 3 different data types in one single array. So we have strings, we have numbers, and we even have booleans, all in the same array. Okay, so let's do some cool stuff with this John array, because there are a couple of, let's say, functions that we can apply to an array. So in the last lecture, we saw what functions are. There is a couple of functions that are specific to arrays. So in order to use them, we do it like this. So we write the array name, which is John, and then we write the function name, and we can start with push. And what push does is that it adds an element at the end of the array, and it actually changes the original array. So let's say that we want to add at the end his favorite color. So we would put blue in here, and after that, if we log the array into the console, then we would not only have the data that we inserted here, but at the end we would also have blue. So let's check this out, and here it is. So John Smith 1990, teacher false, and then blue. So push is a function or a method, which we will talk about later in the next lecture, that simply adds an element to the end of the array. Let's now see another function, another method, which is called unshift. So John.unshift, and let's say Mr. So unshift adds an element at the beginning of the array. So we want to add to our array that John is Mr. John Smith. Oops. So let's check this out. Alright, and now it's Mr. John Smith, 1990, teacher false, and blue. And the next one is pop. And this one doesn't accept any parameters or any arguments that we pass into it, because all this does is to remove from the end. And it also returns the removed value. So let's check it out. And here we go. So blue is now gone, because once again pop removes the last element from the array, and now it's no longer there. And then you can probably guess that there's a function or a method to remove the first element, and that one is called shift. So shift removes from the beginning. So let's see, the Mr. should now be gone. And right, so John Smith, 1990, teacher false, as we had in the beginning. So we added these two, and then these two just removed it. And the last one, which is a really cool one and really useful, is called index of. Index of. And what this does is that it returns the position of the element that we pass into it. So let's say we pass Smith. So this should probably return 1, because Smith is the element number 1 of this array. Remember that it's 0 based, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this will actually return a value, so we have to store it in a variable in order to be able to console log it. Or we could also do an alert, in this case, just to make something different, you know. So let's just say alert the index of Smith. Alright, number 1. Cool. So as I said before, this is the element number 1 of the array, and that's what we return. So let's get rid of this. Probably the most important use case of the index of method is to find out if a certain element is or not inside of an array. So let's say we wanted to know if John is a teacher or not. So we can use once again the if statement here. And now you know why I'm calling it statement all the time, right? It's a statement because it doesn't produce any immediate output. Okay, so John dot index of, and we want to find out if he's a teacher, if the element teacher is in the array. And what I didn't mention yet about the index of method is that if the element is not in the array, it does return -1. So if the element is in there, it of course returns the order number of that element, but if it's not there, it returns -1. So let's say we want to do something if he's not a teacher. So we just console.log that John is not a teacher. Alright, so let's see what happens. Okay, nothing happens because John actually is a teacher. So let's put something else here, like he's a designer. If we load this now, then it says John is not a teacher because it can't find the teacher element in the array. And so this method here, this function, returns -1. And -1 is of course equal to -1. And this means that this line will get executed, and so we get our output here. Alright, and there are actually many more methods or functions for arrays, and we will see a couple of them later. But for now, this gives you a pretty solid foundation about arrays, and I'm sure you could see how useful they are. So join me right now in the next lecture where we'll talk about objects, which are very, very important as well. So see you there.